Sometimes history pivots not on the rise of empires or the fall of kings, but on a single moment of chance. One stray bullet, one misstep in a muddy field, one heartbeat that comes too late. And in that instant, everything changes. What if that moment came not at Waterloo, not at Hastings, but on a February morning in 1525, when a young French king's life was cut short outside the walls of Pavia? What if the death of Francis I had ended not just a battle, but rewritten the balance of power in Europe forever? In the 16th century, Charles V stood astride the world like a colossus. He ruled over lands so vast that daylight touched his banners in every hour of the day, from the silver mines of the Americas to the forests of Germany, from the ports of Antwerp to the castles of Naples. No ruler since Charlemagne had held such a realm. He was King of Spain, Archduke of Austria, Lord of the Netherlands, and Holy Roman Emperor, titles that together made him both the guardian and the prisoner of Christendom itself. His vision was not merely to rule, but to unite, to forge a single Catholic empire, bound together by faith and order, standing as a divine counterweight to chaos. Yet the world refused to yield. The Ottoman Empire surged westward, the Protestant Reformation tore through Germany like wildfire, and France, under its proud king Francis I, burned with ambition to carve its own destiny from Italy's fertile lands. Charles's victories seemed endless, triumphing over France in the Italian Wars, pushing back the Turks at Vienna, and crushing the Protestant armies in the Schmalkaldic Wars. But each victory unraveled into new wars, new debts, new rebellions. His treasury emptied, his body weakened by crippling gout, and his empire stretched beyond mortal reach. In the end, the emperor who had once dreamed of ruling all Christendom surrendered to exhaustion, dividing his world between his son Philip II and his brother Ferdinand I, retreating to a monastery to die in silence. But what if fate had been kinder, or crueler? What if the scales of destiny had tilted just slightly in 1525? It began outside the walled city of Pavia, where King Francis I of France sought to drive the emperor's troops from Lombardy. For months, his army, 26,000 strong, with Swiss mercenaries, German Landsknechts, and the infamous Italian black bands, had surrounded the city. Inside, General Antonio de Leiva held the walls with barely 6,000 men, starving and ill but unbroken. The emperor's relief army, a coalition of 12,000 German pikemen, 5,000 Spanish infantry, 3,000 Italians, and 2,300 cavalry, marched under Charles de Lannoy to lift the siege. Before dawn on February 24th, the two greatest armies of Europe met in the misty park of Mirabello. And here, history took a turn. In our world, Francis was captured alive. But in this one, amid the thunder of arquebuses and the clash of pikes, a single Spanish shot pierced the fog and struck the king in the throat. He fell from his horse, dying within moments, his golden armor darkening with blood. The cry spread like wildfire, "The king is dead!" And with it, the French army's courage broke. Without their monarch, discipline dissolved. The Swiss mercenaries faltered, the Italian auxiliaries fled, and the proud French knights, trapped between the pikes of the Germans and the muskets of the Spaniards, were cut down where they stood. By mid-morning, the field of Pavia was a graveyard. The banners of France lay trampled in the mud, and Italy, for the first time in generations, was firmly under Habsburg control. When news of Francis's death reached Paris, it struck like a thunderclap. The crown passed to his sons, Francis, aged 7, Henry, 6, and Charles, barely 3, far too young to rule. Their grandmother, Louise of Savoy, stepped forward as regent, but France was already tearing itself apart. The nobles whispered, the court schemed, and factions sharpened their daggers in the shadows. Amid this chaos, Charles III, Duke of Bourbon, once the realm's greatest general and now its most bitter enemy, saw his moment. Betrayed by Francis and robbed of his inheritance, he had defected to the emperor years earlier. Now, leading an imperial host, he swept across the Alps to reclaim his birthright. The Emperor Charles V, sensing opportunity, issued the Burgundian decree, proclaiming that the ancient Duchy of Burgundy, long claimed by France, would be restored to imperial rule. The proclamation stirred the old nobility. Families who still revered the names Philip the Bold, John the Fearless, and Charles the Bold now rose to welcome the emperor's legions as liberators, not conquerors. Across the Channel, King Henry VIII of England watched the storm with greedy fascination. Bound by the Treaty of Bruges, he had long plotted with Charles to divide France between them. Now the chance had come. Declaring war, Henry's armies crossed the Channel, led by the Duke of Suffolk, burning their way through Normandy. French resistance, disorganized and demoralized, crumbled before them. Meanwhile in the south, Provence fell swiftly to Bourbon's advancing army. France was collapsing on every front. With the nation bleeding and the emperor's armies closing in, Regent Louise sent envoys to Charles pleading for peace. Her letters begged not for mercy, but for Christian charity upon a mother and her children. The Treaty of Madrid sealed France's humiliation. All claims to Milan, Naples, Artois, and Flanders were surrendered to the emperor. The Duchy of Burgundy was restored to imperial authority. Even the counties of Picardy, Auxerre, Boulogne, and Ponthieu were ceded. It was a political amputation, cutting France off from the arteries of trade and power that had once fed its ambition. In Burgundy, Habsburg troops were welcomed with open gates. The banners of the empire fluttered above Dijon and Beaune once again. Charles of Bourbon, rewarded for his loyalty, was restored to his estates, now bolstered by the County of Provence, elevated to near-royal status. Henry VIII, expecting to seize all of France, was granted Normandy, enough to taste victory, but not enough to rival his imperial ally. While Europe trembled beneath his shadow, Charles V strengthened his position through marriage and diplomacy. His union with Isabella of Portugal not only secured a vast dowry, but bound Spain and Portugal together in blood and fleet. While Charles campaigned abroad, Isabella governed with quiet brilliance, overseeing the empire's finances and fortresses. With Portugal as a naval ally, the Habsburgs now controlled the Atlantic and the Mediterranean alike. In Rome, Pope Clement VII watched in alarm. For years, he had played France and the empire against each other, trying to preserve the church's independence. But after Pavia, the balance was gone. France was crushed, and the emperor's banners surrounded Italy. Facing the dual threats of Ottoman expansion and Protestant rebellion, the Pope reluctantly bent the knee, aligning the Holy See with Charles's empire. Thus, by the end of 1526, Europe had been remade. From the Pyrenees to the Alps, from the Low Countries to the Apennines, all bowed before the eagle of the Habsburgs. For the first time in 1,000 years, the dream of a united Christian empire, one faith, one crown, one emperor, seemed within reach. But the question remained, what happens when one man holds too much of the world in his hands? Would peace finally descend upon Christendom, or would the weight of his own empire tear it apart from within? Upon his grand return to Italy, Charles was crowned King of Italy in Bologna by Pope Clement VII, the same pope who, only a few years earlier, had feared him. It was a ceremony wrapped in both splendor and tension. Golden banners hung from the arches of Bologna, the air thick with incense, as the young emperor knelt before the papal throne. When the crown touched his brow, the balance of power across Italy shifted forever. From the Alps to Naples, the Habsburg eagle ruled supreme. But peace, as always, was an illusion. Even as the bells of Bologna rang, word reached Charles from the north. A new heresy was spreading like plague across Germany. Martin Luther's Reformation was no longer a whisper of dissent. It was a movement that defied Rome itself. To Charles, who saw his crown as a divine mission, this was more than rebellion. It was a disease that could unravel the unity of Christendom. Yet he was not eager to rule by sword alone. His instinct was to heal, not merely to punish. He called for a great ecumenical council, a gathering of theologians and princes to confront corruption, debate doctrine, and restore the church's integrity. But Pope Clement hesitated. He feared such councils, haunted by the ghosts of conciliarism, that medieval idea that popes could be judged by councils of bishops, a notion that had nearly shattered papal authority during the Western Schism. Clement argued that no monarch, not even an emperor, could dictate the course of the church. Yet he was weak, his army scattered, his allies gone. So, reluctantly, he yielded. Preparations began for what history would remember as the Council of Trent, its mission twofold: to confront the Lutheran heresy and to purge corruption within the clergy.
Even as the council's summons spread across Europe, the emperor's world convulsed again. From the east came word of catastrophe, a disaster that would redraw the map of Central Europe. In the summer of 1526, the Battle of Mohács was fought on the plains of Hungary. Suleiman the Magnificent, Sultan of the Ottoman Empire, led over 100,000 men, janissaries in gleaming armor, Sepai cavalry, and thundering cannons that shook the earth. Opposing him stood King Louis II of Hungary, barely 20 years old, commanding 25,000 soldiers, bolstered by a handful of Habsburg reinforcements sent by Charles himself. The result was annihilation. The Hungarian line shattered under Ottoman fire. The plains turned to mud, and retreat became slaughter. Young King Louis, fleeing the carnage, was thrown from his horse and drowned in a marsh. In a single afternoon, the Kingdom of Hungary ceased to exist. The death of Louis II extinguished the Jagiellonian dynasty, leaving two claimants to the shattered realm: John Zapolya, voivode of Transylvania, who bent the knee to the Sultan, and Ferdinand of Austria, Charles's brother, who claimed the crown in Christendom's name. Charles seized the moment. Imperial troops poured into Hungary, securing fortresses and rallying local nobles to Ferdinand's banner. Within months, Royal Hungary was born, a new bulwark of the Habsburg world, a fortress between Christian Europe and the Ottoman frontier. But even as his brother battled in the east, Charles turned once again to the turmoil within the empire. The Reformation had split Germany into two camps, those who sought reconciliation and those who demanded revolution. Charles, ever the cautious monarch, tried to mediate. He believed a compromise could be reached: reform without rebellion, faith without fracture. The first sessions of the Council of Trent met under tense skies. Cardinals debated salvation, bishops argued over indulgences, and imperial envoys tried to balance reform with authority. But no bridge could span that divide. By 1528, the imperial diets of Speyer and Augsburg laid bare the crisis. Moderate princes spoke of loyalty. Radicals, like Philip of Hesse and John Frederick of Saxony, called for open defiance. The Diet of Speyer became a turning point. When Charles demanded enforcement of the Edict of Worms, outlawing Luther's teachings, the Protestant princes stood as one and issued the Protestation of Speyer. From that word, Protestant was born, and with it, war. For nearly a decade, the Protestant Wars raged across Germany. Cities burned, monasteries fell, and brother fought brother. But in this alternate world, France, crushed and isolated, could offer no aid to the rebels. One by one, the Protestant states fell. By 1538, the final blow came at Magdeburg, where the armies of the Schmalkaldic League were encircled and destroyed. Both Philip of Hesse and John Frederick were captured. The Lutheran cause, like the Hussites before them, faded into ashes. Charles had won, but victory carried a price. To ensure such rebellion could never rise again, he enacted sweeping reforms. The Council of Trent, now fully under his control, launched a relentless counter-reformation. Jesuit missionaries fanned across the empire, rooting out heresy. Protestant preachers were driven into exile, many fleeing to Scandinavia, their books burned in cathedral squares. In Germany itself, Charles struck at the roots of noble power. The Reichstag, once the great diet of princes, was stripped of authority. The emperor established a new imperial council in Vienna, centralizing taxation and justice under his personal rule. The empire, once a patchwork of semi-independent duchies, became, in all but name, a hereditary Habsburg monarchy. Lands were confiscated, charters revoked, and rebel estates handed to loyalists, both German and Spanish. Brandenburg, Saxony, and Hesse were carved apart and refilled with men loyal to the crown. Vienna rose as the beating heart of a new empire, the seat of power and judgment. Meanwhile, in France, the death of Francis I's line brought chaos anew. His eldest surviving son, Henry II, had taken the throne in 1536, but his reign was short and turbulent. The nobles, led by Charles de Bourbon, formed the League of the Golden Spurs, demanding the restoration of their ancient privileges. England, ever eager to wound its old enemy, supplied the rebels with gold and arms. For a moment, Europe teetered again. Even some in the Habsburg court urged Charles to intervene. But Henry II, desperate and shrewd,
offered a marriage alliance. His sister Marguerite, only 15, would wed Charles's son Philip once the prince came of age. It worked. The emperor stepped back, leaving the French rebels to fight alone. The Battle of Bourges in 1539 broke the League. Henry's army, though battered, triumphed. But fate was not done with France, for as Henry laid siege to Mâcon, an arrow struck him down. The Valois line again trembled on the edge of extinction. His brother, Charles IX, only 17 and proud, took the throne. Inexperienced yet defiant, he refused peace until another year of war forced his hand. The Treaty of Creuset restored a fraction of noble privilege, but real power remained in royal hands. France survived, scarred, humbled, but intact. Across the Channel, England stood unchanged by the winds of Reformation. Bound to the Habsburg alliance and to Catherine of Aragon, Henry VIII never broke from Rome. His title, Defender of the Faith, was no irony here. It was earned. Under Cardinal Wolsey and Sir Thomas More, the English Church reformed from within, aligning with the decrees of Trent. England and the Empire now stood as twin pillars of Catholic orthodoxy, the sword and shield of the faith. But peace was never the emperor's reward. From the south, the sea itself began to roar. The dreaded Ottoman admiral Harridan Barbarossa swept across the Mediterranean, raiding the coasts of Italy and Spain, seizing slaves and burning ships. His fleets haunted the horizon like a plague of steel. By 1539, Charles had had enough. He gathered 35,000 veterans, hardened by a decade of war in Germany, and assembled one of the greatest armadas in European history. 75 galleys under Genoese Admiral Andrea Doria and the Knights of Malta joined the imperial banners. Off the coast of Tunis, under a crimson dawn, the two fleets clashed, the Crescent and the Cross meeting in thunder and fire. The battle would decide not only the fate of the Mediterranean, but the legacy of the emperor who sought to bind the world under one crown and one faith. By the summer of 1539, the emperor stood at the edge of empire and eternity. He had tamed heresy in Germany, humbled France, and crushed rebellion. But one enemy still ruled the seas, the Ottoman Crescent, gleaming over the waves of the Mediterranean. And so Charles V gathered his might once more, not to defend, but to strike. The Battle of Tunis was fought under a blazing July sun. The emperor's fleet, a coalition of Spanish galleons, Genoese warships, and the indomitable Knights of St. John, cut through the waves like a living wall of iron. Facing them was the feared Admiral Hayreddin Barbarossa, scourge of Christendom, his Ottoman corsairs swarming the sea with speed and fire. The clash was thunder. The Knights' galleys, lighter and swifter, outmaneuvered the Ottoman line, luring them into the range of the imperial artillery. Then came the roar. Andrea Doria's ships, laden with heavy guns, unleashed broadsides that shattered Barbarossa's fleet. Masts splintered, hulls burned, and the sea ran black with smoke and pitch. When the battle was done, the Ottoman armada was broken. Barbarossa fled into the haze, his fleet in ruins. Tunis fell, and Charles restored the Hafsid Sultanate under the loyal Abu Abdullah Muhammad V al-Hassan, a client ruler bound to the Habsburg crown. For 3 days, imperial banners fluttered over the city's white walls. The dungeons were thrown open. 20,000 Christian captives were freed, weeping in disbelief as they saw the cross raised once more above the harbor. Treasures stolen in 6 years of piracy filled the imperial coffers, silks, gold, and jewels destined for Spain. Then the emperor struck again, sending punitive raids to Algiers and Tripoli, burning pirate ports and freeing thousands more slaves. When Charles returned to Spain, the triumph felt hollow. At Toledo, he was greeted by Empress Isabella, radiant and gentle, who had just borne him another son, the infant John. For a moment, the conqueror was again a father. He played with his children, spoke softly to young Philip, who was already being groomed for the throne. But fate, as ever, was merciless. Isabella fell ill with fever soon after his return. Her strength ebbed swiftly, and on a cold winter night, surrounded by candles and prayer, she died in his arms, her last words whispered through trembling lips as she clutched a simple wooden cross. The emperor broke. He donned black mourning clothes and would never again wear another color. For 2 months, he vanished into the monastery of Yuste. praying in solitude, haunted by the silence she left behind. When he emerged, the world saw a man changed, not weaker, but hollowed, driven by purpose sharper than grief. By 1540, Charles carried his court north to the Netherlands, establishing residence at the Palace of Koudenberg in Brussels. There, amid the merchants and canals of Flanders, the imperial family settled. Young Philip was educated under his father's watch, taught languages, diplomacy, and the art of ruling men. He learned Dutch and German for the empire, Italian for diplomacy, and Spanish for the soul of his dynasty. That same year, the Sforza line of Milan expired, and the duchy was absorbed into the empire, another jewel added to the Habsburg crown. For 2 years, Charles ruled from Brussels, strengthening bonds with the Burgundian nobility, weaving the Netherlands tighter into his dominion. Then, in 1543, he journeyed east once more to Vienna, answering his brother Ferdinand's call, for the Ottomans had returned to Hungary. For 15 years, Ferdinand of Austria had waged a slow and bitter war to reclaim Hungary from Ottoman control. Now, with imperial aid, the final reckoning came. At the Battle of Kaschau, the armies of the Cross met the hosts of the Crescent once again. John Sigismund Zapolia, the puppet king of Transylvania, commanded the Ottoman vassal forces. The fighting raged for a day, gunpowder smoke choking the fields, sabers flashing in sunlight. But when dusk fell, the Habsburg banners still flew. Zapolia was captured, his army shattered. Hungary was united at last, not as an independent kingdom, but as a fortress under the House of Austria. That same year, Philip and his young wife Margaret, now bound by both marriage and politics, were dispatched to govern the Low Countries, guided by Charles's sister Mary, the regent of the Netherlands. The couple proved capable and dutiful, learning the burdens of governance that would one day define an empire. In 1545, tragedy once again reshaped Europe. In Paris, the young King Charles IX of France, arrogant and untested, rode into a quarantine district closed off by plague. When warned of the danger, he laughed. "No king of France ever died of plague," he boasted. And, to prove his immortality, he slashed open the doors himself. Within a week, he was dead. The Valois line was finished. The death of the dynasty threw France into anarchy. 3 claimants rose: Henry VIII of England, invoking ancient Plantagenet claims, Charles de Bourbon as the senior noble heir under Salic law, and Philip of Habsburg, whose marriage to Francis I's surviving daughter revived an old papal grant, the forgotten claim of the Austrian archdukes to the French throne. What followed was 4 years of war, a civil war of kings. England struck first, seizing Normandy and Calais. But when Henry died in 1547, the Tudors' claim collapsed, and the English withdrew, leaving Bourbon and the Habsburgs to decide France's fate. In 1549, the reckoning came at the Battle of Tours. Charles de Bourbon led 18,000 loyalists. Philip commanded 41,000 men drawn from Spain, Burgundy, and Savoy. The clash was thunderous, cannon fire shaking the fields, knights and landsknechts locked in brutal melee. When the dust cleared, Bourbon lay dead, his army destroyed. France had fallen. That autumn, Philip entered Reims, where, beneath the vaulted ceiling of the ancient cathedral, he was crowned King Philip III of France by the archbishop. For the first time in history, Spain, France, and the Holy Roman Empire were united under a single dynasty. But the young king understood his father's warning. No nation accepts its conqueror easily. Working hand in hand with Emperor Charles, Philip dismantled the old French kingdom, fragmenting its strength so it could never again rise against him. Aragon expanded northward, absorbing Languedoc and Provence. Brittany, newly detached from the French crown, became a loyal Habsburg vassal. Burgundy was enlarged, stretching almost to the gates of Paris. Dauphiné, once the inheritance of French kings, was restored to the empire. Navarre was finally united under Spanish control. To bind the French nobility, Philip redistributed lands among loyalists, Spanish grandees, Burgundian lords, and German counts who had stood beside him. The fleur-de-lis still flew, but now beneath the double-headed eagle of the Habsburgs. When Charles V died in 1558, he left behind something no ruler had possessed since the fall of Rome: a world united in one hand. The crowns of Spain, France, Germany, and much of Italy rested upon the head of his son. In Rome, Pope Julius III crowned Philip as Emperor of the Romans, the supreme sovereign of Christendom. The bells of St. Peter's thundered as the crowds shouted, "Viva l'Imperatore!" For a moment, the dream that had haunted Europe for 1,000 years seemed realized. A single emperor, one faith, one realm, from the Atlantic to the Danube, from the Pyrenees to the Alps. Chroniclers called it Austria est imperare orbi universo. Austria is destined to rule the world. And so it did, at least for a time.